founders have a problem. It is one man, three different archetypes, three different stories for one particular operation. The politicians, they have the exact same problem as the founders.
How do you communicate to venture capitalists?
A founder makes sure that all his parallel narratives are flowing in very flawlessly together without confusing the essence of their brand. That's perhaps one very big takeaway for introverted founders.
A lot of this depends upon the way in which you're communicating the story. It's not just about concocting the right story and using a formula and going for it. Now, the founder has the same issue.
Founders have a problem. They have several stakeholders. All of them are important. All of them have their skin in the game, and all have just the one glue holding them to the company, which is the founder's vision. He has investors to believe in him, employees to be happy with him, and customers to buy from him. And the problem is, they all seem to speak a very different language. Have you noticed that the politicians, they have the exact same problem as the founders? There are too many stakeholders, there are too many different stakes, they have one person to believe in, and all of them need a different goal that they need fulfilled. So let's begin with this episode in drawing a parallel with one of the most popular political figures on a global scale, Narendra Modi. And what makes this comparison interesting is everyone who likes or dislikes Modi does so for starkly different reasons. It's as if this one man has so many different stories working around him that he brings out this passion or the dispassion even in the most apolitical people. I'm pointing at you. And for such diverse reasons. So let's begin our discussion with looking at the root problem. Why do you think that a politician even needs so many stories? What do these different stakeholders really want?
A politician is like a chameleon, right? He has to be, or she has to be like a chameleon. You have to appeal to different stakeholders. You have to appeal to people who have believed in you a few years ago and now you're not living up to those promises. Then you are looking at people who are looking at options for the next election. So you have to speak with them. You also have to, make sure that the higher ups in your party are feeling really good about you so that they can promote you internally. So that's your third stakeholder. Your fourth stakeholder can be people who, especially if you're in a position of power, they might be internationally placed. The fifth would be your opposition. The sixth could be, some spy agency. I could go on and on and on.
Now, for example, if we take one of the most topical things going on at the moment, which is the Operation Sindoor, right? Without going into the political background of it. Now, Modi was faced with is actually being faced with a very typical challenge where he has to, showcase different kind of archetypes of his own, different stories for these different stakeholders. For instance, the hero archetype of Modi has to say that India won't back down. There are tariffs coming. So the government is increasing the defense equipment manufacturing, funding more startups which are developing defense drones, privatizing, the military development, etc. Right? So that's the hero archetype. Then there is an everyman that needs to speak to the rural India, the people who have lost their sons and their daughters in the Operation Sindoor, or people who's, everyday army people who are fighting on the borders every day, and the rural India especially, that is seeing a major drift because of all of these tariffs, the fisheries industries, the agriculture, the dairy industries, etc. So the everyman of Modi first of all, he named the operation as Operation Sindoor, which is something that, we all would advocate for. The Operation Sindoor represents losing your men to the militants, to the terrorists, right? So with that, he's telling them that he will fight for his sisters and mothers, and at the same time, he starts building on the campaign to make India an agricultural first nation, which is a major rural India concern. At the same time, he also has to tell the world that India is not dependent on US, and he starts making deals with the forgotten African nations for the BrahMos BrahMos exports. Then this is the creator archetype that he's making for the international community that brings to the forefront how India is pioneering even amidst all of the geopolitical issues. So looking at Modi, it is one man, three different archetypes, three different stories for one particular operation or one particular situation. So I think this is a very good parallel on what founders kind of face in every days. Now, for example, there is a new product that a founder has to launch, or founder is, for example, looking for a Series B, Series C kind of an investment. So there are different stakeholders. He has to appease the investor. He has to appease his employees. He has to appease the consumers. None of them speak the same language. All of them, they need a different story. The investors want to understand the ROI of the company. They want to understand the long-term vision of the company, right? At the same time, the employees, they need to understand that, the company is breaking barriers, and the employees, they are going to benefit from this barrier breaking, shattering the glass ceiling one day once they get the returns for being an early part of this company and staying with it. Then the consumer, they have to understand, we are scaling to serve more people who need this solution. We are bringing value added product to you. This brings us to the archetype, and where the founders need to understand who their archetype is, who their primary archetype is, and then who their secondary archetypes are, secondary and tertiary archetypes are, and which archetype is to be activated for which kind of a stakeholder, and which story actually forms best for which kind of an archetype, so that each story flows very flawlessly, without sounding inauthentic for the founder, without sounding salesy, without breaking that trust within that founder. So what do you think?
I think the craziest thing is, if I now circle back to Mr. Modi, it's a very interesting thing that you mentioned. You also have to communicate a story to the enemy. You also have to communicate a story to probably Mr. Trump. You also have to communicate a story to potentially for your country, right? So now, if I have to juxtapose this with a founder, right, you have to communicate a story to your competition. You have to communicate a story to about your company, and you have to communicate a story to people who are in power, perhaps the government in this case. Now, the crazy thing, Janavi, over here is you have archetypes, and I think there's 12 or 15 archetypes that we are all, we all know, and maybe we can have a list over here which will make sure that people can recognize their own archetype. What I think is really interesting is to not only recognize your primary archetype and your secondary and tertiary archetype, but you must understand one critical thing. It's not as if you can activate one archetype and deactivate the other two. You see, the problem is that you have to keep all things alive, because there can be cross-pollination in social media, there can be cross-pollination in real life, and if your stories are going to mismatch, you're going to create a problem.
Investors are anyways watching your social media. They are following the company that they have invested so heavily in. If they see you promising heavy discounts to the consumers, or if they see you promising the employees to get Diwali bonuses from that investment money, it's definitely not going to work, right? So every language has to appease to the different stakeholders in such a way that it all comes together and makes everybody happy.
Absolutely, and your archetype has to work for you. Like, for example, you might some of you might be able to rock the everyman archetype even with an investor, right? But your product or service has to be then everyman, because then your investor will feel, oh, this person is living their story. Okay, this person knows exactly what they're talking about. They come from this sector, etc., etc. But the fact is that it need not necessarily convert itself into sales with customers or clients if it doesn't resonate, and if you don't move to the creator archetype or something of that sort. So the movement has to be very subtle. Let me give you an example of Kaushik Subramaniam, who's put up a really nice Instagram video on how do you communicate to venture capitalists. So it was a very, very interesting video that I saw. It's a very short one. What he was saying was that when you're trying to raise a fund, what you have to do is you cannot start communicating your story just when you're raising a fund. What you have to do is start meeting up with potential investors way before and communicate your story there, right? And I'm paraphrasing him. You have to communicate your story there, and you've got to meet people when you are not like burning for money. Because then you're communicating not just the right story, but with the right intent and the right calmness and the rest of it. So a lot of tone and manner also goes on. And then what he says is, as a follow-up, after a few months, after you've set these people up, start communicating very rapidly, saying, hey, I am looking for funding. Okay, and I have talked to various people. People have shown interest. Would you be interested? We've talked about this before. And then very rapidly start communicating that story to a bunch of investors at the same time. Now, this means that then the urgency is flipped. The urgency goes to the investor, right? And it becomes a really good story to communicate. The urgency then becomes, the compelling factor. And what he's saying, and here's the killer, your story can then be pivoted with the feedback that you get from, say, the first 4 investors. If you're reaching out to, let's say, 30 people, the first 4 investors, you can actually get feedback from, twist the story around, and this is where your archetypes can come in.
That's interesting. What would you suggest for founders who haven't thought about story or building their own story with the DNA of their archetypes till now, and now they're looking for investment suddenly, or now they're looking to go into market very, very rapidly with their new product?
I think the key thing is that it doesn't take you long to understand your archetype or archetypes. These fancy sounding terms are actually things that you can quickly decipher what your archetype is. Is it a creator? Is it everyman? Is it hero? Is it sage? Etc. 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 What you have to do is perhaps spend about half a day to understand your primary and secondary archetypes. You might think it's a waste of time because there are so many urgent things that are happening for a founder when you're starting. However, I'm still understanding that you can spend a few hours understanding that. You have to connect that with your story. You have to connect that with your product and your service story, which is the second step, and see how that same story can be expressed differently with your different archetypes or avatars.
Okay, so let's do a role play over here. I'm a young
Sure.
founder who doesn't know their archetype or story right now. I will always have a bias in my head. For example, I'm a D2C skincare brand, right?
Okay.
So for me, my archetype will be the product that I'm selling. Will it be for the skincare? Will it be a sage archetype or a caregiver archetype because it is a skincare wellness product? Or is archetype what my personality is?
Archetype is what your personality is, not what your product or service is, because you might very well be an influencer who has over 100K followers on Instagram. Now,
Hmm.
suddenly you have already created a story for yourself, and then you're trying to leverage that archetype that is already accepted by your community into skincare. Right? Or you might be somebody who's like has zero followers on Instagram,
Yeah,
and you're now trying to build your own, thing based upon your archetype. So the thing still comes back to you. You have to understand what archetype you are and what will make you the most believable, the most compelling, the most radiant, the most charming, etc., 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 and then find out how your service can connect. A lot
right.
of us want to distance ourselves from the stuff that we are doing because we might be a little introverted, we might be a little shy, we may not want our face on the on the
Yeah.
camera, and there are various ways to circumvent that. But unfortunately or fortunately, the founder's biggest weapon is their own archetype and their own story.
That is true. I always say that any company's DNA or any company's brand archetype is actually the mixture of the archetype of its founders.
Yes.
Generally, what brand this is a very common problem that you look at the category and then you build your archetype according to that, right? But if that archetype is not you, if it's not your personality, if it doesn't match your vision, you might just get into the market. People might buy your product for the first time because it's something new in the market, but your story is not going to resonate. Why is your story not going to resonate? Because your actions are not going to justify that story, right? At the
Yes.
end of the day, who is acting? It's your personality that is making the strategy for that company. It
Yes.
might be a sales strategy, it might be your channel strategy, might be your social media strategy, whatever it may be, right? It might be your investment strategy, what kind of investors you go to, what kind of sales channels you deploy, right? What kind of employees you hire. That is not going to depend on the category. You are not going to go and say, okay, it's a skincare brand, so let's get all caregiver personality people into my company. At the end of the day, you are going to like the people that you interview based on your own personality, and
And
this is
that's
where your archetype and story have to come into the picture.
and this is the only way in which you can create content consistently,
Yeah.
because then that would be more authentic, more close to your real self. Yes.
Now, looking at that Modi example, right? He had three different stories, three different archetypes, and 140 crore or other 8 billion people of an audience to speak to. Right now, how does this one man make sure, or a founder make sure, that all his parallel narratives are flowing in very flawlessly together without confusing the essence of their brand?
See, you have to recognize the context in which you're operating. Like, for example, Mr. Modi's Swachh Bharat thing was not going to work during Operation Sindoor, right? It was a very internally focused thing. It was a very internally focused story. So there is no mention of Swachh Bharat or anything of that sort of late, is it? So now, if I have to look at it, I think the key aspect is to identify the context that you're in and see what the main story is going to be for the next, say, 3 to 6 months or even 9 months for yourself.
Hmm.
I think that is your core story. Now, that core story may be communicating to your first customers, like your innovators or early adopters, or
Yeah.
if you're just launching a brand, or maybe it might be communicating to your investors or potential investors, whatever it may be, whatever stakeholder. You got to choose one main stakeholder, and for that, because that's the context that you live in, right? And for that context, you have to create your core story.
Hmm.
Once you create the story, then you can literally have a mind map which allows you to map out different stakeholders which are emanating from that core story and that core archetype that you're going for, right? So your core archetype is connected to your main story, but now when you have those offshoots, say your customers, your prospects, your employees, etc., etc., that's when you got to ask yourself that question: which archetype am I
Hmm.
going to use to communicate the same story to for the stakeholder?
So your brand archetype and your story somewhere takes the form of whatever situation that you are in at the moment, right? Like, so Swachh Bharat has been an everyman archetype story, right? But and
Yes,
that somewhere translated into what we can do for the rural India, Mere Kisan Bhai and the fishermen, and that is how the
all of
story,
that. Yeah.
yeah, moved
Yeah.
into that picture. So somewhere the archetype never shifted. The archetype remained the same for the target audience. The story somewhere evolved from Swachh Bharat. Why was Swachh Bharat happening? Because of sanitation, for because of a healthy nation. And at the same time, that Swachh Bharat from a clean India campaign became a healthy India campaign where agriculture first and dairy first took place. So
I think what you're saying is a very interesting point. So, and you can use it both ways. What you're saying is, I think, maybe a little contrarian to what I was suggesting. What
okay.
you're saying is keep the main archetype, but then use the same archetype in different contexts and communicate it. So your archetype is not changing,
Yeah.
right? So that's one way of doing it. But I don't think Swachh Bharat was a big success. Okay, and in terms of actually keeping the country clean, okay, or actually seeing, and there might be a reason for that. The reason might be because you see the core archetype was not kind of split into the different types of archetypes which can appeal to different audiences, right? So if I'm talking to fishermen, if I'm talking to, there is a different archetype involved. It might be an everyman archetype. The problem with a top politician like Modi is this tension between actually always speaking as the prime minister and then talking to a specific segment. Now the founder has the same issue, the
Yeah.
founder has the same problem, and therefore finding those other archetypes is very critical, whether it's for a top politician like Mr. Modi, or it is for a founder. You have to find the secondary and tertiary archetypes as well, and you have to be able to mold it. You have to literally be very conscious about the kind of communication that you're giving and which archetype is doing that. Let me give you an example. Like,
Yeah.
for example, if I'm looking at communicating about your D2C skincare brand, and you're talking to your, and let's assume that you're an influencer, and let's assume that you've got 100K followers who all love you because you have been absolutely open about the way in which you had problematic skin. Sorry, no, I'm not talking about you, problematic skin. And then, you've done all these different kinds of things, and you've experimented. And because of this experimentation, etc. So now you've already established yourself as a creator,
Mhm.
right? As an explorer, maybe the explorer archetype, right? So
Right.
now the explorer archetype has to now convert itself. So now you're creating a skincare brand and you're talking to non-followers, let's assume, because that's a different segment.
Yeah.
So will the explorer archetype work? No, because you're going to give more certainty over there.
Hmm.
So the certainty has to be one of a creator rather than an explorer. So the same story has to be communicated differently. Is this making sense?
That makes sense. Or the innovator archetype, that I'm bringing
Or
something
the
new.
exactly, yeah.
So your target audience needs, your archetype needs to connect with that target audience. Now here is a question. You brought in the example of an influencer. Most of the founders, so there are influencers who become founders because
Sure.
of their influence. They start a brand, but most of the founders that start as a founder, they are always in the back end, right? They
Yes.
are
A
never
lot of
on
them.
the stage, right? So for them, if I am a founder and I'm watching this video, the first thing that would probably occur to me is that all I have to do is meet investors in a closed door setting. I have to meet my employees, probably one on one, or maybe the company retreats. They already know who I am. All they care about, is the work and the pay and the day to day kind of things. And the consumers, they are not hearing from me. They are perhaps hearing from the influencers. They are hearing from my social media manager. So how does finding my archetype really benefit the company? I mean, there are different people who are deploying my different stories at different spaces.
So this is a typical introverted founder who is at the back end, who is letting
Yeah.
other people control the narrative, and this can sometimes work for you. So the founder has to then find a co-founder or somebody who becomes the face of the company and be able to trust that person and their archetypes to communicate. So that's option number one. Option number two is a slightly meta one, but I'll give it to you in any case. A lot of these founders actually become more empowered to speak when they think about the company or the mission that they're connected to. So, like, for example, what would my company stand for? What would they go for? And then suddenly they embody that archetype. So they're embodying that archetype within themselves, and they talk as if they're an extension of the company as the main thing, and then they will find it easier. And thirdly, Janavi, I think a lot of this is plain and simple down to two things. One is inertia, because it's not your strength, and two is that there's always something urgent that's going on, so you're
Yeah.
always kind of putting it at the back burner. And
Yeah.
what you must understand, dear founder, is if you have to make a difference, you have to invest in the long term as well, right?
Yeah.
You have to invest in the mid to long term. You have to make a difference, otherwise you're just going to move from one fire to the other fire.
Yeah, I also think, just to add on top of it, I also think that knowing your archetype isn't just about communication. It's not just
No.
about how your story is being presented to a particular stakeholder. Now, for example, going back to the Modi example, Modi was being a domestic figure during the Operation Sindoor.
Yes.
He was completely inactive. He was, for a while the operation was going on for those 2 weeks, he was completely inactive on a global scale. And
Yes.
so he was being the hero archetype for the country. He was being the everyman
Yes.
defender for our agricultural products and all of that, right? Now, at the same time, Modi being I guess you can say the creator archetype, or again the hero archetype, another version of the hero archetype. He deployed Jai Shankar to go on the international scale as his advocate, as his representative to represent India with that hero archetype. right?
Not
And
just that, but he got Owaisi and Shashi Tharoor to
exactly,
do
I
that.
was coming to that. Yeah, he
Yeah.
deployed he deployed troops like Shashi Tharoor and all of these people. So somewhere it was that archetype of his that was at a play. Now you might call it being self-aware of what my archetype needs to communicate. Now that might not be you communicating, right?
Yeah.
It might be your actions communicating. It might be your agent communicating it to the outside world, to a particular group of stakeholders. But at the end of the day, it is still your archetype. And if you don't know that archetype, then it's going to become very difficult for you to communicate what you want to say when the crisis actually strikes.
Again, it goes to context. Again, it goes to the most important stakeholder, which was the citizen of the country, and what you're communicating when you cancel. When you cancel a state visit or something like that, which I
Yeah.
think Mr. Modi did, is a story by itself.
Hmm.
Because what you're doing through your behavior, through your actions, is communicating what's really important for the country, and that is communication. When that is supplemented by other people going out, then it really makes and meshes and makes a big difference.
Now, for a founder, now let us take some examples of the world's best founders. How do they make everyone feel like they are the target audience while speaking to different stakeholders in different languages with different archetypes?
I've heard about Shah Rukh Khan, that when you are actually in a room with Shah Rukh Khan, he makes you feel, and when he's talking with you, he makes you feel that you're the only person that matters to him, right?
Okay.
And that is a skill, that's a real talent, when you feel the full focus of somebody's attention onto you in a specific context, and you feel completely empowered because of that person's energy. And so I think a lot of this depends upon the way in which you're communicating the story. It's not just about concocting the right story and using a formula and going for it, right? It's
Yeah.
not about asking Chat GPT, what story should I use, I'm going for this meeting. Because while that might be a supplement, or while that might be a sort of something that is an add-on, you have to understand, okay, I'm going over here, this person needs to understand my archetype, even if I do not communicate a single word,
Mm.
right? how
Yeah.
how does my aura, how does my energy come through?
Yeah. I think Steve Jobs did this very well. Steve
Yeah.
Jobs is universally loved, right?
Yes.
There are even the people who hate him very passionately because they love Wozniak, but they have a specific, very particular reason to hate him. But even they are in awe of him because he was such a marketing genius. And
Yes.
every time he spoke, I mean, even when he was telling his investors to go to hell, his aura was such, that the investors still followed him. That
Yes.
1984 ad, it was a complete slap on the face of the investors and the board of directors of Apple. But even after that ad, it made them follow him. Right? The innovators of the world, they loved his idea, even though they knew that the inventor was someone else. Macintosh hasn't brought anything new to the foray at all. It is just a new, pumped up, hyped up device. Even though Apple is doing the same thing today, Tim Cook is not able to present that kind of an aura. He's not able to speak to everybody. He's at the end of the day just speaking to the people who are already into the Apple ecosystem, right? Steve Jobs brought everyone into the Apple ecosystem, even if you weren't using an Apple product at that moment.
Absolutely, because he came across as a creator, as an inventor, as an innovator. So he was
Yeah.
fully embodying his archetype.
Yeah.
And so that's one. And the second thing is that he also had that, because he was kind of introverted. So he had that ability to actually speak for Apple. He probably asked himself this question: what would Apple want me to say? And that is something that would be very powerful for an introverted founder.
Hmm.
What would my company want me to say right now? And then it suddenly instills you with a sense of purpose.
That is a very profound statement, honestly, and I can completely understand, being an like introvert ambivert myself. Whenever there is a cause that you're talking about, whenever your company becomes the cause, whenever you are embodying what your company should stand for, somehow speaking or somehow representing that story becomes extremely easy. So that's perhaps one very big takeaway for introverted founders who don't communicate to the outside world their
Yeah.
vision. So now, if a founder is walking on this journey of finding his archetype and then narrating his story according to those archetypes, what is the first step that he needs to take?
Janavi, if you noticed in all of our workshops with clients, what we have figured out is that the first session is a very internally driven thing. What's my purpose? What's my values? What's my archetype? And those are the sort of things that allow for better communication. A lot of people think it might be a waste of time, but it is probably the most significant step that any founder can take. So that's the first step. And then you look at your main archetypes, and then you look at your main context and what you're trying to address. I would say the giving up or the sacrifice of secondary goals is also critical to start with. And then you can look at various stakeholders and see how you can apply different archetypes for different things. I think there is that probably is a broad blueprint about what a founder can
Yeah.
do.
Kill your darlings and understand your wife.
Absolutely. Kill your darlings. First point, absolutely agreed.